There are places on this planet that do not need explanation. It is enough to say their name out loud in front of someone who has truly sailed and watch what happens on their face. It is not fear exactly, nor is it respect in the calm sense of the word. It is something older, more physical, more like the instinctive recognition of a force that does not negotiate. Cape Horn, a rock. A small island at the very edge of South America, swept by clouds that never quite managed to pass all the way through. From a satellite, it looks like an irrelevant detail, a speck at the end of a continent. From the deck of a ship, when you have been at sea for days, and the wind has been reminding you for just as long that you are not welcome, that rock is the most important thing in the world. It is the point you must get past in order to stay alive, or the point that stays in front of you forever. For 4 centuries, this was the only route between the Atlantic and the Pacific for anyone who did not want to go around Africa. It was not a romantic choice or an adventure. It was pure logistics. Cargo holds full of goods, commercial deadlines, marine insurance, and a single certainty upon departure: that the price of passage was set by the ocean, not the ship owner. More than 800 ships were wrecked here. Between 10,000 and 20,000 men died in these waters over the centuries. On Horn Island today, there is a metal monument that the wind beats without pause. No one visits it very often. The weather is almost never good. What makes this place different from any other dangerous sea on the planet is not a specific storm, nor a season of the year, nor a streak of bad luck. It is a combination of forces that exists only here, that has no intention of stopping, and whose origin must be sought long before any ship ever existed. To understand Cape Horn, one must first understand that combination, not the history, not the shipwrecks. The physics of what happens when the geology, oceanography, and meteorology of the Southern Hemisphere decide to act all at once in the same 800-kilometer corridor. 41 million years ago, South America and Antarctica were still connected. They shared a coastline. Between them there was no ocean, only continuous land that closed the passage between the South Atlantic and the South Pacific. Then the tectonic plates did what they have been doing since the planet exists. They moved. They separated slowly, millimeter by millimeter, over millions of years, until the land that connected them disappeared beneath the sea, and a channel was left between the 2 continents. That moment changed the planet in a way that all living beings that came after have suffered in some form. Because at the instant that channel opened enough, something happened that had never happened before in the history of the ocean. Water began to circulate around Antarctica without finding any obstacle to stop it. Not a current. A system, a continuous circular flow, moving from west to east around the coldest continent in the world, without any mountain range, any island, any exposed sandbank interrupting it at any point along its path. Thus was born the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, the most powerful ocean current on the planet. It moves between 100 and 150 million cubic meters of water per second. That figure is difficult to make tangible, but there is a comparison that helps. The Amazon River, the most voluminous river in the world, moves approximately 200,000 cubic meters per second. The circumpolar current moves in that same second between 500 and 750 times more. It is not a marine current. It is the circulatory system of the Southern Hemisphere. And all that mass of water, in its endless circuit around Antarctica, reaches a point where geography forces it to pass through the narrowest corridor of its entire route. 800 kilometers between Cape Horn and the South Shetland Islands. For a system of that scale, 800 kilometers is a slit. As it is compressed, the water accelerates. Velocity gradients between different layers of the flow generate gigantic-scale vortices. The kinetic energy of an entire ocean is concentrated in a space that, in relative terms, is a crack. To that must be added what the wind does, and what wind does in the Southern Hemisphere is something that has no equivalent in any other latitude on the planet. In the Northern Hemisphere, westerly winds travel eastward but constantly collide with continental obstacles. Europe slows them. Asia deflects them. North America breaks them apart. Each collision with land steals energy from them. In the southern hemisphere, by contrast, the continents fade away as latitude decreases. Below 40 degrees south, there is practically no land in any direction. The circumpolar winds can circle the entire planet without finding anything to stop them. Lap after lap, accumulating energy over thousands of kilometers of open ocean, continuously strengthening themselves. The sailors who navigated these latitudes gave them names that are not metaphors but working descriptions. The roaring 40s between 40 and 50 degrees south are winds that blow without pause for days, capable of sustaining 130 kilometers per hour in conditions that, for them, are ordinary. The furious 50s between 50 and 60 degrees are what the roaring 40s are at their worst. The screaming 60s, near the Antarctic Circle, are the band where wind stops being measured in kilometers per hour and starts being measured by what it is capable of tearing away. Cape Horn lies exactly where those atmospheric bands arrive with all their accumulated energy, and also meet the funnel formed by the Patagonian Andes to the north and the Antarctic Peninsula to the south. That funnel does not channel the wind in an orderly way. It compresses and accelerates it beyond what is recorded in the open ocean at the same latitude. The passage does not merely receive the winds of the southern hemisphere, it concentrates them. The effect on the sea is a direct consequence of basic physics. Wind transfers energy to the water's surface. The longer it acts over an unobstructed distance, the more energy the waves accumulate. In the Drake, that distance is practically unlimited. The waves that reach the passage are not formed there. They have been building for thousands of kilometers. The result is waves that commonly exceed 15 meters in height, that reach 20 meters in serious storms, and that in some documented records have reached 25. But height is not the most destructive factor. Shape is. The waves of the Drake are long. They have periods of up to 18 seconds between crests. This means that when the bow of a ship rises to the top of one wave, the stern is still descending from the previous one. The rolling motion generated by that pattern is not what the human instinct expects when it imagines storms. It is not a sudden udar. It is a slow, gigantic oscillation that destroys the structural stability of any hull not specifically designed to withstand it, that lifts the propeller out of the water intermittently, depriving the engine of thrust and control, and that turns every task a sailor tries to perform on deck into a balancing act on a surface that never stays still. When successive storm fronts also arrive from slightly different angles, what forms is called a cross sea. Trains of waves that intersect at angles the hull cannot anticipate. One wave comes head-on, another comes from the side, a third arrives diagonally from below. The ship receives all three impacts in sequences that have no predictable rhythm. For the crew, this means working on a deck that moves in 3 dimensions at the same time, in any direction, without warning. The water temperature adds the layer that turns any mistake into something irreversible. In the passage, the water ranges between 2 and 6 degrees Celsius, depending on the time of year. A human body exposed to water at that temperature loses muscular coordination within minutes. The ability to swim disappears before the cold becomes subjectively unbearable. On board a sailing vessel in a storm, stopping the ship to rescue someone who has fallen overboard is not a rescue operation. It is a second way of losing the ship. The sailors of the 19th century knew it. When someone went overboard, the ship kept going. Cold also acts on the structures themselves. When Antarctic air comes into contact with seawater pulverized by waves, ice begins to form on every exposed surface of the ship, masts, rigging, sails, deck. It is not an aesthetic layer. It is dead weight that accumulates on the highest parts of the vessel, exactly where it does the most damage to stability. Within hours, that buildup can amount to tons. The ship's center of gravity rises. The heel increases. And the vessel begins to list without being struck by any large wave at all. 19th century sailors described entire days spent chipping ice off the rigging with axes and mallets, leaning out over the void, unable to stop, because stopping meant the ship would keep tilting. Icebergs are the threat that gives no warning. Antarctic melt releases icebergs that currents push northward. 90% of an iceberg's mass lies beneath the surface, which makes what is visible a completely unreliable guide to what lies below. And in fog conditions, which are common in the passage, even that visible part cannot be seen. The fog forms when humid air coming from the north meets the cold waters of the circumpolar current. It can reduce visibility to zero within minutes. The first warning of an iceberg in those conditions was often the sound of the hull tearing. There is also, within the passage, a specific geographical trap that has killed a number of ships difficult to calculate. On Host Island, about 56 kilometers northwest of the true Cape Horn, there is a rock formation whose profile, seen from the west in fog and heavy seas, resembles that of the real Cape. Many captains confused one for the other. When the fog lifted and the true position became clear, the ship was tens of kilometers from where it believed itself to be, usually already with the currents pushing it toward land. The seabed adds the final variable. The passage rests on the Scotia Plate, a tectonic fragment wedged between the South American and Antarctic plates. Movement between these plates generates constant seismic activity. Frequent undersea earthquakes can abruptly alter current and wave patterns. And the topography of the seabed, with sudden depth changes in relatively small areas, causes waves to steepen and shorten at specific points in ways that are unpredictable to any captain who doesn't know that exact stretch. Wind that does not stop. A current that concentrates the energy of an entire ocean. Waves of 20 meters with periods that destroy stability. Temperatures that turn a fall into the sea into a death sentence. Ice that silently raises a ship's center of gravity. Invisible icebergs in the fog. A false cape that confuses position, seismic activity on the seabed that changes conditions without warning. There is no other stretch of sea on the planet where all these factors act together with the same intensity throughout the entire year. Not the Bay of Biscay, not the North Sea in winter, not the Strait of Malacca. The Drake is its own category. All of this was waiting for the first European navigators who tried to sail far enough south to find a passage to the Pacific. The most immediate danger was not the open ocean. It was the labyrinth that came before reaching it. And the man who would lead them through that labyrinth was someone willing to kill his own officers before turning back. In 1519, there was no ocean south of the Americas on any European map. There was land. A colossal continental mass that cartographers called Terra Australis Incognita, whose existence seemed almost a mathematical necessity. The continents of the northern hemisphere were so large that the planet needed land in the south to remain in balance. A conviction that no one had been able to refute, because no one had gone far enough south to verify it. That belief had direct practical consequences. If there was solid land south of America, then there was no passage. And if there was no passage, the only way to reach the Pacific from Europe was to go around Africa to the east, a long route controlled by Portugal and subject to the conditions of the Indian Ocean. For Spain, which needed access to the spice-rich Moluccas without relying on routes controlled by its rival, finding a western passage was a matter of commercial and political survival. Ferdinand Magellan set sail from Sanlúcar de Barrameda on September 20th, 1519, with 5 ships and around 250 men. He was Portuguese in the service of the Spanish crown, and he carried information that he kept with a discretion bordering on state secrecy. The conviction that the passage existed. He had not seen it. No one had seen it. But he had access to Portuguese documents suggesting that someone, somewhere along the southern coast of South America, had found indications of an opening. That was enough to risk the expedition, enough to risk his life. The fleet sailed south, hugging the American coast for months. The southern winter caught them in San Julian Bay in Patagonia, and the pause that followed was not a stop along the way. It was a fracture. Hunger had been present on the ships for weeks. Rations had been reduced. The coast to their right was desolate, cold, and offered absolutely nothing. The men saw no sign that the passage Magellan promised existed, and they had already spent months at sea for that promise. In the early hours of April 2nd, 1520, the captains of 3 of the 5 ships rose against him. Luis de Mendoza, Gaspar de Quesada, and Juan de Cartagena coordinated the takeover of their vessels with the intention of forcing Magellan to turn north and return to Spain. It was a calculated mutiny, not an outburst of desperation. They had numbers. They had 3 of the 5 ships. They believed logic and force were on their side. Magellan responded in a way that made it clear there was no scenario in which he considered turning back. He sent a boat to the San Antonio with a messenger who stabbed Captain Mendoza before he could react. With Mendoza dead, that ship's crew had no leader. Magellan retook the vessel within hours. He tried Quesada, condemned him, and executed him. Cartagena and a priest who had supported the rebellion were left ashore on that desolate Patagonian coast with minimal provisions, thousands of kilometers from any European settlement. Nothing more was ever heard of them. The message was unequivocal. This man was not turning back. Whatever lay ahead, whatever it might be, was the only path forward. Before resuming the voyage, the Santiago was wrecked while exploring the mouth of a river. It was the 5th ship. Now there were 4 left. On October 22nd, 1520, while skirting the Patagonian coast, someone on board saw what looked like an opening in the coastline, a mouth of water that did not end in a beach or a river. Magellan sent 2 ships to investigate. It took days for them to return. When they did, they reported that the channel continued westward, that they could not see its end. It was the strait that would later bear his name. Crossing it was not a journey. It was a weeks-long puzzle. The Strait of Magellan is a labyrinth of channels, branches, blind passages, islands that look like peninsulas, and currents that change direction without visible reason. The ships advanced along one arm, reached a dead end, and had to turn back. They tried another. They found water that continued, but in the wrong direction. The shores were sometimes lined with indigenous Fuegians who lit fires upon seeing the ships, signs of human presence in a land that seemed like the edge of the world. Those fires gave the land its name, Tierra del Fuego. The willy wars made every mile more difficult. These are katabatic gusts that drop from mountain slopes without warning, reaching more than 100 kilometers per hour in seconds. In narrow channels where maneuvering space is measured in meters, these gusts could throw a ship against the coast before the crew had time to release a sheet. There was no way to anticipate them, no way to evade them, only to react, and the speed required was at the limit of what ships of the time allowed. During the crossing of the strait, the ship San Antonio disappeared. Its pilot, Esteban Gomez, seized control by force, turned around, and set course for Spain with 59 crew members. Those who remained did not know for days. When they understood, the fleet already had a gap it could not fill. Magellan went from 4 ships to 3 without losing a single one at sea. On November 28, 1520, after more than a month zigzagging through that labyrinth of water and rock, the 3 remaining ships exited the strait at its western end and entered an ocean that Magellan named the Pacific Sea. The relative calm of that ocean after what they had crossed gave it its name on its own. They were alive. They had found the passage. The planet was circumnavigable. But there is a detail that the epic narrative of that moment often overlooks. Magellan had not crossed the Drake Passage. He had taken the inland route. The labyrinth of Fuegian channels had carried him into the Pacific without ever touching the open sea south of the continent. That ocean, the one that surrounds Antarctica, that concentrates the circumpolar current and the winds that have been circling for millions of years without obstacles, remained an absolute unknown to Europeans. They did not know it existed. They did not know that the continent they had on their left while crossing the strait did not extend indefinitely to the south, but instead ended in an island, and that beyond that island there was open water all the way to the pole. Magellan would never discover it. He died on April 27th, 1521, on the shores of Mactan in the Philippines, during an encounter with local warriors who outnumbered him, and who had no reason to surrender to the flag of a European king they had never heard of. Juan Sebastián Elcano took command of what remained and arrived in Sanlúcar de Barrameda on September 6, 1522, 3 years after departure, with 18 men out of the 250 who had set sail. The only ship that completed the voyage, the Victoria, arrived in such a precarious condition that it had to be towed up the river to Seville. The first circumnavigation of the globe had cost the lives of 93% of those who undertook it. The route through the strait was an extraordinary achievement, but it was also a bottleneck. Whoever controlled its shores militarily controlled the passage between the two oceans. For any nation other than Spain seeking access to the Pacific, the Strait of Magellan was a door in enemy hands. This turned the search for an alternative route farther south through open sea into a top priority strategic objective. It was not sought by any explorer with that specific mission. It was found by storms, throwing sailors who were not looking for it into latitudes where European maps had previously placed nothing but assumptions. The story of how Europeans discovered that there was open ocean south of Tierra del Fuego and not a continent is essentially the story of three men who were carried by storms into places they did not want to be, saw things they were not looking for, and whose information the world took decades to properly understand. The first was Francisco de Hoche. In 1525, a Spanish expedition set sail from the Iberian Peninsula bound for the Moluccas. The route was the already known one, the Strait of Magellan, the Pacific, spices. Hoches was the pilot of the San Lesmes, one of the ships in the fleet. When the expedition attempted to cross the strait, storms scattered it. The San Lesmes was driven south, away from the strait, toward latitudes that no European had deliberately recorded. The conditions pushed it to 55 degrees south latitude, right at the edge of what is today the Drake Passage. What Hoces saw from the deck of the San Lesmes amid waves and fog was water. Open water extending south where maps showed land. No visible boundary, no coastline appearing on the horizon, no continuation of the continent that all cartographers had drawn with absolute conviction for generations. But the storm that had taken him there did not give him time to record it with the precision that would have turned that sighting into a formal geographical discovery. The San Lesmes was forced back north before Hoces could establish reliable coordinates, draw a chart, or document the finding with the rigor required by the cartography of the time. The passage that today bears Drake's name in Anglo-Saxon cartography bears Hoces' name in Spanish, recognizing that first sighting without being able to certify it as a discovery. A man who saw the correct thing at the wrong moment without the means for the world to believe him. The second was Francis Drake. In 1578, the English privateer sailed with the Golden Hind on what would become the second circumnavigation of the globe. He crossed the Strait of Magellan without a major incident, entered the Pacific, and began advancing north along the American coast. Then a storm arrived. Not just another storm that an experienced navigator absorbs and survives, a multi-day tempest with a fixed direction and unrelenting force. Drake was pushed south and east, beyond the Fuegian channels, beyond Tierra del Fuego, beyond any nautical chart he carried on board. When the wind finally eased, Drake looked in every direction from the deck of the Golden Hind and saw no land anywhere, only water. The American continent was too far away to be visible. To the south, to the east, to the west, only ocean. The English Navy recorded what he had seen and turned it into intelligence of the highest strategic value. The name Drake Passage was born decades later from British cartography, not from any deliberate nautical achievement by the privateer. The third to arrive was the first to do so in a deliberate and documented way, and he did it after an accident destroyed half his expedition before it even reached the true starting point. Isaac Lemaire was a Belgian Huguenot merchant based in the Netherlands. The VOC held a legal monopoly over the two known routes to the Moluccas. Any ship using them without a license was confiscated, but if a third route existed, it would lie outside that monopoly. Isaac Lemaire placed his son Jacob in charge of the expedition and hired Captain Willem Schouten to command the Eendracht. The second ship, the Hoorn, carried Schouten's brother as captain. They departed from Texel in June 1615 with 87 men. The voyage south was relatively orderly until January 1616, when the expedition was anchored in a bay on the Patagonian coast, and they attempted to clean the hull of the Horn from marine organisms that were slowing it down. The method was to burn the hull below the waterline while the ship was beached, a common practice at the time. The fire got out of control. The Horn was completely consumed within hours and sank in shallow water, where the crew was able to recover some equipment, but not the ship. From that point on, the entire expedition depended on a single hull. Logic dictated turning back. Without a backup vessel, any serious failure of the Eendracht would condemn the 87 men who remained. Jacob Lemaire and Schouten continued south. On January 25, 1616, they sighted the strait between Tierra del Fuego and an island to the east, which they named Staten Island. That strait was given the name Lemaire Strait. 4 days later, on January 29th, they rounded the southernmost tip of the American continent and named it Cape Horn, in honor of the lost ship and Schauten's hometown. It was the first time a European ship had documented rounding that point and entering the Pacific by that route. And in doing so, they definitively demonstrated what Hotze had intuited nearly 100 years earlier, and Drake had confirmed without seeking it. Tierra del Fuego was not the edge of any southern continent. It was an island. The Terra Australis Incognita that had lived on European maps for generations was, at least in this region of the globe, a philosophical illusion. The real world was more open, more maritime, and far more dangerous than geographers had imagined from their studies. The arrival at the VOC headquarters in Batavia, in what is now Indonesia, was the opposite of the reception it deserved. Governor Jan Pieterzoon Cohen heard the expedition's account and made a decision that combined corporate arrogance with monopoly paranoia. He did not believe they had found a new route, or he pretended not to believe it, which in practical terms amounted to the same thing. He had them all arrested. He confiscated the Eendracht. He sent them back to Europe as passengers on other ships, without their vessel, without their instruments, without their charts. Jacob Lemaire died during the return voyage. He never saw the discovery he had paid for, with the loss of the only ship he had left and half of his expedition recognized in his lifetime. His father, Isaac, spent years fighting in Dutch courts until, in 1622, he obtained financial compensation and formal legal recognition of the route. The irony that ultimately defined the story was this. The company that eventually exploited that route commercially was not any of the Lemaire enterprises. It was the Dutch West India Company, the direct competitor against whose monopolies they had fought. Jacob had given his life to open a door that his enemies used. Cape Horn now had a name, coordinates, and a first documented crossing. What no exploration narrative could convey was what it meant to turn that achievement into industrial routine. The dangers of discovery are the dangers of the unknown. The dangers of routine are worse. They repeat with a consistency that the human body is not built to absorb indefinitely. Those who survived enough crossings developed their own culture and hierarchy. And the difference between them and the rest was not courage. It was something more specific and much harder to learn. The worst problem of the Cape was not the sea, it was the direction. The prevailing winds in these latitudes blow from west to east, always, with the consistency of a physical law, not the variability of a meteorological phenomenon. A ship attempting to go from Buenos Aires to Valparaiso, that is from east to west, sailed permanently against the wind, with no windows of calm that could be used to gain advantage, no possibility of finding a favorable angle that lasted more than a few hours before the wind returned to its usual direction and erased the progress. For a sailing ship, sailing against the wind means tacking, moving diagonally, turning, advancing in the opposite direction, gaining distance westward in an oblique pattern. In the Drake, the strength of the wind and the sea state made every tack a high-risk event, and the distance gained with each maneuver was minimal. Captains described days in which the ship advanced 3 net kilometers west after having sailed 60 in total. On bad days, the ship did not advance. It moved backward. The same currents that, moving eastward, carried water with extraordinary efficiency became, in the opposite direction, a liquid wall pushing the ship back toward the Atlantic, while the wind drove the sails toward the Cape. Some ships spent 2 months trying to round the Cape from east to west without succeeding. Provisions ran out. Crews reached a point of physical exhaustion where maneuverability disappeared. And at that point, the only possible decision was to give up. Turn east, cross the Atlantic, go around Africa via the Cape of Good Hope, and reach the Pacific from the other side. Weeks of struggle against the sea reduced to nothing. The most costly defeat in terms of time and resources in 19th century navigation. Those who managed to round the Cape from east to west paid for it with an exhaustion that is difficult to describe to anyone who has not lived it. Watches were periods of intense physical labor separated by intervals of partial collapse. Clothes never dried. Cold was the normal state, not an episode. Sailors slept in narrow bunks with water moving beneath the floor and woke every few hours to urgent maneuvers. Tasks that were routine in normal seas became high-risk operations in the Drake. Going aloft into the rigging to reef a sail, that is, to reduce the surface of canvas exposed to the wind, required climbing shrouds that moved in wide arcs while the ship pitched and rolled, reaching the yard at 20 or 30 meters above the deck, holding on with the body while the hands worked the sail, and doing so often at night or in reduced visibility due to rain and spray. A taut line that snaps in those conditions strikes with the energy of a moving steel bar. A yardarm can swing with the sudden force of a battering ram when the ship is hit by an unexpected wave. A sail flapping in a storm is not fabric. It is a surface exerting forces of several tons on everything within its reach. Fatigue was the factor that turned known tasks into accidents. A sailor who has not slept more than 3 hours at a time for 4 days, in constant cold and on an unstable deck, takes twice as long to do what he would normally do and performs it with half the precision. In the Drake, that degradation in performance coincided exactly with the moment when the ship most needed fast, coordinated reactions. Those who survived enough crossings to develop the physical understanding of what the Cape demanded belonged to a category formally recognized in the naval hierarchy of the time, the Cap Horniers. The term referred specifically to those who had rounded the Cape from east to west, the difficult direction, the one against the prevailing winds. Those who had completed the double passage, outward and return, formed an elite within the elite. The recognition was not merely symbolic. It had concrete expressions in life on board. A Cap Hornier was entitled to wear a gold earring in the left ear. Those who had completed both crossings wore 2. And within the rigid hierarchy that governed every aspect of life aboard a ship of the era, a Cap Hornier had the privilege of sitting with one leg on the table during meals. A minor act of insubordination that in any other context would have had consequences. In the context of Cape Horn, it meant that this man had demonstrated something the naval hierarchy recognized as superior to formal discipline, that he had survived the South enough times to know exactly what he was worth. In 1937, in Saint-Malo, the Amicale Internationale des Capitaines au Long Cours Cap Hornier was founded, the formal fraternity of those who had rounded the Cape in command of a vessel. The organization stopped admitting new members when there were no longer active sailing ship captains who qualified. It began to fade on its own. In 2003, it ceased its activities because the last member had died. The culture of the Cape outlived all its protagonists and then disappeared with them. The season of 1905 is the number that best summarizes what the Cape could do when conditions aligned at their worst. 53 sailing ships attempted to round the Cape that year. 53, none succeeded. Some sank outright. Others were so badly damaged they had to be abandoned. Those that managed to escape eastward reached Patagonian ports, with rigging destroyed, crews depleted, and hulls with damage that would take months to repair. The Cape did not need any exceptional storm that year. There was no extraordinary meteorological event recorded. It was enough for it to be what it always was. The 19th century was the century in which the Chilean saltpeter trade turned Cape Horn into an industrial artery. The mines of northern Chile produced nitrate in quantities that Europe demanded continuously for fertilizers and explosives. Transporting that saltpeter to European ports meant crossing the Cape on every return voyage, fully loaded to the limits, under deadlines set by industry, without regard for weather conditions in the south. Shipping companies responded by building the largest ships the world had seen up to that point. The German shipping line Deadliest, based in Hamburg, designed the flying P-liners, steel sailing ships with 4 and 5 masts, carrying sail areas of thousands of square meters, hulls optimized to withstand wave impacts that would have destroyed any wooden vessel, and minimal crews to maximize cargo capacity. The Preußen, launched in 1902, was 147 meters long and carried more than 5,500 square meters of sail. It was so fast under favorable winds that its passage times rivaled steamships. The Pamir from the same fleet was the last commercial sailing ship to cross the Cape without auxiliary engines. It did so in July 1949, carrying a cargo of wheat from Australia on a voyage that took 128 days. When it passed the meridian of Cape Horn with all 4 masts intact, it was closing an era that had begun when Magellan set sail from San Luca 4 centuries earlier. No one on board knew it. There was no closing ceremony, just a ship passing a point in the ocean as it had done dozens of times before. 8 years later, on September 21, 1957, the Pamir was sailing from Buenos Aires to Hamburg with 3,780 tons of barley and 86 people on board, including 52 cadets from the German Merchant Marine on their first major voyage. Hurricane Carrie intercepted her 100 kilometers southwest of the Azores. The ship lost its rigging. Poorly stowed cargo shifted in the holds, causing her to list up to 30 degrees to port, submerging the lifeboats on that side. 6 people survived. 80 died. The last great sailing ship of the Flying P Line did not die at Cape Horn. It died in the North Atlantic, thousands of kilometers from the south. But it died exactly as dozens of ships before it would have died in the Drake, alone, in a full storm, with no time for rescue, and with cargo becoming its own executioner. The Cape did not need to be present. It had only taught the mechanics. In August 1819, Spain sent a southern expedition with ships that no competent inspector would have approved for such a passage. What the Drake did to one of them did not end where shipwrecks usually end. It ended in a continent that European maps had not yet drawn. In August 1819, 3 badly deteriorated Spanish ships entered the Drake Passage in the middle of the austral winter. Command was held by Brigadier Rosendo Porlier, a veteran of Trafalgar. When saying goodbye to a friend in Cadiz before setting sail, he said, "Goodbye, Francisquito, probably until eternity." It was not literature. It was the calculation of a sailor who knew the southern seas and understood the condition of the hulls they were taking with them. Storms broke the flotilla apart within days. The San Telmo, with 30 years of service and poor maintenance, lost its rudder, its bowsprit, and its mainmast. Without steering or propulsion, it ceased to be a ship. It became a floating structure, moved wherever the wind chose. On September 2nd, the frigate Prima Rosa Mariana saw it for the last time, drifting south with its rudder disabled. The position recorded in the logbook was 62 degrees south, 70 degrees west. Those coordinates were not in the Drake. They were in Antarctic waters. The other 2 ships reached Callao. Nothing was ever heard again of the San Telmo and its 644 men. In 1822, King Ferdinand VII formally struck them from the records in a brief administrative note. What makes this story different from all other southern shipwrecks happened 2 months after their disappearance. On October 19, 1819, British Captain William Smith landed on King George Island in the South Shetlands. Official history recognizes him as the first human to set foot on Antarctic soil. But the diary of Captain Robert Fields records that on the north coast of Livingston Island, they found remains of a recent Spanish shipwreck. The specific detail, a figurehead with a rampant lion, the emblem of Spanish Royal Navy warships. If those remains were from the San Telmo, the ship had been driven into Antarctica 2 months before Smith landed. The 644 men may have reached that continent before any official exploratory expedition. not as an expedition, as shipwrecked sailors. The seal bones found in the same location suggest that someone survived long enough to hunt. How long? How many? There is no documented answer. The physical remains of the ship were most likely destroyed in the furnaces of British seal hunters who arrived on those islands from 1820 onward. In a land without a single tree, the wood of a 52-meter warship was too valuable a resource to leave on the shore. The last traces of the possible first human contact with Antarctica were burned in the fires of an industry that did not know what it was consuming. In 1916, Ernest Shackleton reached the Drake in the only way that ocean accepts someone crossing it without preparation, by force. The Endurance had been crushed by the ice of the Weddell Sea. After months drifting on the ice and reaching Elephant Island in lifeboats, Shackleton assessed the situation. A deserted island, outside all shipping routes, with no chance of incidental rescue. He set out in the James Caird, a 6-meter boat with an improvised wooden and canvas deck toward the whaling station of South Georgia, 1,300 kilometers across the South Atlantic. 17 days, an interior space the size of a cupboard, water seeping through every seam, someone bailing constantly to keep the boat from filling, ice building up on the hull until it threatened stability, forcing the men to climb outside in full swell and chip it off by hand. Frank Worsley, the navigator, steered using a sextant that could only be used when the sun broke through the clouds, and arrived 20 kilometers from his objective, an island 170 kilometers long in the middle of the open ocean. Any larger error would have meant being lost. The 22 men waiting on Elephant Island were rescued 3 months later. All survived. Worsley had sailed every ocean in the world. He wrote that crossing was the most terrifying experience of his life. The same passage that accumulates this history of shipwrecks and survival is today one of the most important climate regulation systems on the planet. The Antarctic Circumpolar Current absorbs 600 million tons of atmospheric carbon every year. The turbulence it generates on the sea floor sustains the global thermohaline circulation, the ocean conveyor belt that moves heat and nutrients across all oceans. And it keeps frozen the 26 million square kilometers of Antarctic ice, which, if melted, would raise sea levels by 58 meters. Accelerated Antarctic melt injects fresh water into the salty ocean and alters the density that drives this system. If the circumpolar current weakens, the absorption of carbon weakens with it, along with the rate of melt and the climatic balance of the southern hemisphere. The corridor that for centuries devoured ships is the same one that today prevents the sea from rising into cities. On December 9, 2019, a Chilean Air Force C-130 Hercules took off from Punta Arenas with 38 people on board, bound for an Antarctic base. It crossed the airspace over the Drake. 1 hour later, it disappeared from radar without a distress signal, without any reported anomaly. The wreckage was found at sea: fuselage, seats, human remains, no complete black box, no witnesses, no definitive explanation. The C-130 is an aircraft designed for extreme conditions. In the Drake, it was not enough. Between 2,000 and 3,000 ships still cross Cape Horn every year. Post-Panamax vessels, too large for the Panama Canal locks, have no alternative. They encounter the same ocean Magellan, Hoses, and Shackleton encountered. Instruments are incomparably more precise. Satellite meteorology forecasts fronts days in advance. But prediction reduces randomness without eliminating punishment. Knowing where the ship is does not prevent a 20-meter wave from breaking where it chooses to break. Cape Horn exists because 2 continents separated 41 million years ago. Humans arrived much later, found that corridor, and decided to cross it. Some succeeded, many did not. The ocean did not distinguish between them. It still does not. On a nautical chart, the Cape is a coordinate. In reality, it is the place where the planet remembers that there are forces that have never asked anyone's permission to exist and have no intention of negotiating.